The phone call came at 3:47 in the afternoon on a Tuesday, and even before I heard her voice, I knew something was catastrophically wrong. It was my ex-wife Patricia, and in the 17 years since our divorce had been finalized, she rarely called me directly anymore. When she did, it was always through lawyers or emails about Marcus, our son. My hands were already shaking as I put the phone to my ear. Standing in the middle of my office on the 42nd floor of the Harlow building downtown, watching the city sprawl out below me through walls of glass that suddenly felt too transparent. "He's gone," she said, and the words didn't make sense at first, as if she was speaking a language I had once known but had forgotten. Marcus was 23 years old. He was alive yesterday. He had sent me a text message about some coding project he was working on for his job at a tech startup in Seattle. The words, "he's gone," didn't fit into any framework my brain could construct. "What do you mean gone?" I asked, my voice sounding strange and distant, like someone else was asking the question while I watched from very far away. "He's dead," Patricia said, and I heard the tremor in her voice, genuine grief, undeniable and raw. "There was an accident. A car accident on I-90 near Snoqualmie Pass. He was alone. He hit a patch of black ice and went off the road. I don't remember sitting down. But suddenly I was on the floor of my office, the phone still pressed against my ear, and I couldn't speak or breathe or do anything except exist in this new world where my son was no longer in it." Patricia was still talking details about which hospital, about identifying the body, about funeral arrangements that needed to be made, but the words were just sounds, just vibrations in the air that meant nothing. I had raised that boy alone for 15 months after the divorce was finalized, just the two of us in a small apartment in Portland while I built my career. I had been there for every scraped knee, every school play, every moment of his childhood until Patricia got custody. She had won that battle through some combination of her lawyer's skill and my own inexperience with navigating the legal system. I was earning good money even then, but not enough to buy justice back in a courtroom where custody was supposedly never about money. She took him to Seattle when he was 4 years old, and I became the weekend father, the after-school visitor, the man whose role in his son's life was carefully prescribed and limited. But I never stopped being his father, never stopped calling every Wednesday night at 7 p.m., never missed a single birthday or Christmas or Father's Day. I had watched him grow through brief visits and video calls, watched him graduate from high school despite my absence, watched him choose to move to Seattle for college partly because his mother was there and partly, I suspect, because it made me easier to ignore. He was in his 20s when he finally started calling me sometimes without me having initiated contact. We had begun to build something real, something that wasn't mediated by resentment or legal agreements. And now that was gone, obliterated, erased as if it had never existed at all. When is the funeral? I heard myself asking, my voice mechanical and hollow. "Saturday at 2 o'clock, Patricia said. "The service will be at Calvary Episcopal Church on Capitol Hill. We're doing it here in Seattle because that's where his life was, where his friends are. I'll send you the details." I registered what she was saying with the part of my brain that still functioned, the part that was still anchored to practical reality while everything else was dissolving into chaos. I would need to book a flight. I would need to arrange time off work. I would need to buy a black suit and prepare myself to watch my son's casket being lowered into the ground. "I'll be there," I said. "I'm grateful," Patricia replied, and there was something in her tone that caught my attention, some undercurrent that didn't match the situation. It was gratitude, yes, but it was also conditional, as if my attendance at my own son's funeral was something she was conferring on me as a privilege rather than acknowledging as an absolute right. I didn't have time to process that strangeness because she continued talking. "But I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Were you supplying Marcus with money?" The question landed like a physical blow. "What?" I asked. "Money," Patricia repeated, substantial amounts. Over the past year, I found evidence that someone was sending him money regular thousands of dollars a month. I assumed it was you. I had sent Marcus money, yes. When he had moved into his apartment at 22, he had called me struggling with rent and student loan payments. I had set up a monthly transfer of $2,000, no questions asked, nothing discussed. It was what fathers did, what I should have been able to do all along if I had won custody. It was my attempt to make up for 17 years of absence, my way of being useful to a son who didn't particularly need me to be present. Yes, I said. I've been helping him with rent and expenses. Is that a problem? The silence on the other end of the line lasted so long that I thought the call had dropped. Then Patricia's voice came back, and it was entirely different, colder, sharper, with an edge of something that sounded like anger. That's going to need to stop, she said. In fact, I think it would be best if you didn't attend the funeral at all. The service is for people who actually played a role in Marcus's life, and showing up now, after all these years of barely being involved, would only complicate an already difficult situation. It wouldn't be respectful to his memory. I sat there on the floor of my office, the phone gripped so tightly my hand had gone numb, trying to process what was happening. My son had just died, and his mother was telling me not to come to his funeral. She was telling me, in so many words, that I wasn't entitled to my own grief, that my presence at this final moment would be an intrusion rather than a necessity. You can't be serious, I said. Patricia, he's my son. I have to. You have nothing to do, she cut me off. And the money you've been sending him, I need to know exactly how much. It's going to affect the estate distribution. And there it was. The real reason for the call. This wasn't about my attendance at the funeral or about what was respectful to Marcus's memory. This was about money, about the monthly transfers I had been making, about how much liquid value I had given to my son that Patricia apparently believed she was now entitled to claim. I don't care about the money, I said. You can keep all of it. I just want to say goodbye to my son. Well, that's not going to happen, Patricia said, her voice taking on a tone I remembered from the custody battle, that specific texture of righteousness mixed with cruelty. The funeral is for family, and frankly, you forfeited that claim a long time ago. I've already started working with an attorney to examine those transfers. If you try to contest my decisions regarding Marcus's estate, I'll make sure the legal process becomes very expensive and very public. Goodbye, Marcus's father. The line went dead. I was alone in my office, surrounded by glass walls and the ambient hum of a building full of people living their lives, completely unaware that the world had ended for at least one person inside it. The next 48 hours blurred together in my memory now, collapsed into a single expanse of shock and disbelief and a rage so profound that I could barely contain it within the boundaries of my own body. I didn't go into work the next day. I called my boss, a man named Richard, who had never particularly cared about my personal life as long as the quarterly reports were submitted on time, and I told him I had a family emergency. He gave me a week, which I appreciated more for its brevity than its generosity. Bereavement leave was typically 2 weeks, but I suspect Richard's instinct was that I wouldn't want to come back to the office too soon. I spent that first full day after the call in a fog, moving through my apartment like someone navigating underwater. My place was on the 35th floor of a luxury building in downtown Portland, all glass and steel and expensive furniture that I had chosen based on what I thought a successful man should own rather than what would actually make him happy. I sat on my couch, Italian leather, $7,000, stain resistant, and I couldn't stop myself from laughing at the obscenity of it. My son was dead, and I was a man with expensive furniture and a bank account that meant nothing because it couldn't buy back a single moment I had missed. The laughing turned into something else, something that I recognized only later as the beginning of something that would consume the next several months of my life. It started as a simple question, small and sharp and impossible to ignore. Why had Patricia called me only to tell me not to come? A grieving ex-wife would have called to inform me of the death, yes, but she would not have spent that call trying to drive me away. She wouldn't have immediately pivoted to discussing my financial transfers. She wouldn't have mentioned an attorney and threats of legal action within minutes of telling me that my son was dead. None of that added up. None of that made sense. So I began, without fully intending to, without even consciously deciding to do it, to examine the edges of what she had told me. I pulled up the conversation in my mind, word by word, phrase by phrase. I analyzed her tone, her timing, the way she had structured her argument. And what I found in that examination was a pattern, a texture of calculated manipulation that I recognized from our marriage. Patricia was a woman who moved through the world with a very specific intention, to extract maximum value from every relationship and to eliminate any obstacle that stood between her and that value. In our marriage, that obstacle had been my happiness. In our divorce, it had been my access to Marcus. And now, apparently, it was my presence at the funeral and my potential claim to understanding what had happened to my son. I made a decision then, standing in my apartment with the Seattle skyline visible in the distance, a skyline that had become, in just a few hours, the landscape of my grief. I decided that I would not accept Patricia's narrative about what I was entitled to. I decided instead that I would find out exactly what had happened on that highway, exactly why Marcus had died, and exactly what Patricia was trying so desperately to keep me from discovering. I didn't know then how deep that decision would take me. I didn't know that my choice to investigate, to question, to refuse to be eliminated from my own son's death, would uncover a level of betrayal so profound that it would reshape every relationship in my life. But I was beginning to sense it, beginning to feel the weight of something massive and terrible lurking just beneath the surface of what Patricia had so quickly told me. And I was going to find out what it was, no matter what it cost me. If you were him, would you have accepted that rejection, or would you have felt the same compulsion to know the truth? I didn't go to the funeral. That first decision to honor Patricia's request, to acknowledge her authority over this moment, came from a place of such profound shock that I could barely make any decisions at all. I sat in my apartment on Saturday afternoon at 1:45 p.m., knowing that in Seattle, 150 miles away, a church was filling with people who had known my son. Friends from his college days, colleagues from the startup, relatives I had never met or seen only briefly at weddings I had been invited to out of obligation rather than desire. I sat there knowing that my absence would confirm something that Patricia had already decided, that I was not essential, not central, not truly necessary to the narrative of his life. And I let it happen. I let her take this final thing from me without raising my voice, without fighting, without insisting on my fundamental right to say goodbye to the child I had brought into the world. Later, I would wonder if that capitulation was a tactical error, or if it was necessary, if accepting this rejection was the only way I could position myself to uncover what really needed to be uncovered. Either way, by the time the funeral was over and Marcus's body was in the ground, I had already begun the work that would consume the next 6 months of my life. And the first place I went was to Marcus's apartment in Seattle. I told myself it was to gather his belongings, to make sure nothing was disturbed or overlooked. Patricia had already sent a team of people from her church to organize things, which in her vocabulary meant to have complete access to every aspect of his private life. But what I was really looking for, what I already suspected, on some level, existed was evidence. Evidence of something. I didn't know what yet, but I knew that Patricia wouldn't have worked so hard to keep me away if there wasn't something to find. I drove up on Tuesday, 3 days after the funeral that I hadn't attended. It was a 6-hour drive up I-5 through increasingly gray weather, through landscape that became more forested and mountainous the further north I went. By the time I reached Seattle, the sky had turned into the kind of heavy, unrelenting gray that the Pacific Northwest specialized in, The kind of weather that made even a bright person feel like they were living in a photograph that had been left out in the rain. Marcus's apartment was in a converted warehouse in Ballard, the kind of neighborhood that had been industrial 5 years ago and was now aggressively trendy, full of people who made good money and spent it on artisanal coffee and overpriced workout studios. He lived on the 3rd floor, and I had visited exactly twice, once when he first moved in and once a few months before he died. A visit that had been brief and awkward, full of the kind of conversation that happens between people who love each other but have very little actual intimacy in their lives. The landlord met me there, a woman named Sandra, who had clear instructions from Patricia not to let me take anything without documentation. I smiled at Sandra, thanked her for her time, and told her I understood. I had learned by that point that cooperation was a more useful stance than confrontation, at least at the beginning. Once Sandra left, I stood in the center of Marcus's living room and felt the weight of his absence in a way I hadn't expected. The apartment was exactly as he had left it. There were dishes in the sink. There were books stacked on the nightstand next to his bed. There was a framed photograph of him at 8 years old, taken on my weekend, standing at the edge of the Columbia River in Portland with a huge smile on his face. I had taken that photograph and he had kept it. For 17 years, through every life change and transition, through the distance between us that could have easily erased me from his memory, he had kept that photograph. I sat down on his bed and I cried. I hadn't cried since the phone call. Had been too shock-locked and rage-filled to process the simpler, more overwhelming emotion of simple loss. But here, in the physical space of his life, surrounded by his objects and his books and his choices, the loss became real in a way that no amount of abstract reasoning could have made it. He was gone. He would never add more objects to this collection. He would never sit on this bed and think about his future or his past. He would never call me on a Wednesday night and tell me about something that was happening in his life. And I had missed the funeral, had let his mother dictate my own grief, had allowed myself to be erased from the final moments of his life. That knowledge was almost more unbearable than the knowledge of his death itself. But eventually the crying stopped, the way it always does, and I began to look. Not with the frantic energy of a person searching for something specific, but with the methodical attention of someone who understands that evidence doesn't announce itself, it has to be found. I went through his desk first, with gloves on that I had brought from my apartment. His laptop was there, closed, and I didn't know his password, so I couldn't access it. I made a note of the brand and serial number. I found a bank statement that showed regular deposits from Patricia's account. Substantial monthly amounts that far exceeded what would have been necessary for simple parental support. I found a deed to a small property in Vashon Island, an island across Puget Sound from Seattle, that was listed in his name but that I knew he didn't live in. I found correspondence from a lawyer, not Patricia's lawyer, but someone else, about a trust that had been established in Marcus's name. The more I found, the clearer the picture became, and the picture that emerged was of a son who was far more financially enmeshed with his mother than I had understood. Patricia had told me, over the years, that she was helping Marcus with expenses, covering his costs while he was in college and getting established in his career. I had accepted that narrative. But what I was finding suggested something different, suggested that Marcus wasn't receiving help from his mother so much as he was being managed, controlled, and positioned as a conduit for something, or someone. I made copies of everything. I used my phone to photograph every document, every paper trail, every piece of evidence that suggested a relationship far more complicated than the simple mother-son dynamic that Patricia had always described to me. And then, on the second day, while going through a locked drawer in his bedroom that I had to pick open with a credit card, I found the letters. There were 6 of them, each one in an envelope, each one addressed to me in Marcus's handwriting. None of them had ever been sent. The first letter was dated 6 months ago. Dad, it began. I don't know how to tell you this face to face, so I'm writing it down first. I think something really bad might be happening, and I'm scared to tell you directly. I'm scared because telling you means it has to be real, and right now I'm still hoping that I'm wrong. But I think Mom has been using me, using my name and my credit to move money around in ways that I don't fully understand. When I asked her about it directly, she told me that it's all part of protecting my financial future, that she's building me a legacy. But the numbers don't make sense, Dad. The money coming in through these transfers is way more than what she could possibly generate through her legitimate income. And I don't know where it's going. I sat on the floor of Marcus's bedroom, reading his words, and I felt something shift inside me, some fundamental piece of my understanding of who my ex-wife was and what she was capable of. This was no longer simply about paternal jealousy or the bitterness of a man excluded from his son's life. This was about something darker, something criminal, something that Patricia had been keeping carefully hidden, possibly for years. I read all 6 letters, each one progressively more frightened, each one revealing more of what Marcus had discovered or suspected about his mother's activities. In the last letter, dated just 2 weeks before he died, Marcus had written, "I'm going to talk to a lawyer. I'm going to find out if what's happening is actually illegal. I know that might destroy our relationship, but I can't keep being part of this if I don't fully understand what it is. I just wanted you to know, Dad, that if something happens to me, I don't know why I'm thinking about that, but it's in my head now. I want you to know that I tried to do the right thing. I tried to tell someone. I tried to get help. I love you. I'm sorry for all the years I've been distant. I'm sorry for not letting you be my father. These letters changed everything. I was no longer a grieving father investigating the circumstances of his son's death out of personal curiosity or bitterness. I had evidence that my son had discovered something illegal, evidence that he had been distressed enough to consider seeking legal counsel, and evidence that 2 weeks later he was dead. It could have been an accident. The police had concluded that it was an accident, black ice on a highway, driver lost control, no other vehicles involved. But it could also be something else entirely. I sat there on the floor for a long time, processing the implications of what I had just read, understanding gradually that my entire understanding of my son's death was being rewritten. Are you beginning to see how quickly the world can shift when you start looking at what's really happening beneath the surface? Have you ever found something that made you question everything you thought you knew about someone you trusted? The following weeks were a masterclass in conducting an investigation while making it appear as though I was simply a grieving father processing loss. I went back to work. I performed normalcy. I attended meetings and reviewed reports and maintained the appearance of a man who had experienced a tragedy but was pressing forward with the business of living the way men were supposed to. But in the evenings and on weekends, I was building a case. I had no formal authority to investigate anything. I was not a lawyer or a private investigator. I was simply a man with access to information and a growing compulsion to understand the truth. The first thing I did was reach out to Marcus's bank, claiming to be an heir sorting out his estate, and request copies of his last 2 years of bank statements. Due to the privacy protections around deceased clients, they wouldn't give me direct access, but I was able to work with Patricia pretending cooperation to obtain them. When I reviewed those statements, a pattern emerged that made my hands shake. Large deposits were coming into Marcus's account on a regular schedule, but they weren't coming from Patricia. They were coming from a series of different bank accounts, each one registered to a different company name. The deposits would arrive, sit in the account for a few days, and then be transferred out to yet another set of accounts. Marcus wasn't receiving help from his mother. He was being used as a money laundering conduit, a financial intermediary in what appeared to be a sophisticated scheme. I began to research those company names, searching for any public records or court documents that might exist about them. Some of them appeared in business registries. Some of them had been dissolved years ago. Some of them led to nothing but dead ends and blank corporate filings. But one name kept coming up, appearing across multiple documents and filing types. Pinnacle Holdings, LLC. Pinnacle Holdings was registered in Delaware, incorporated 5 years ago, with an official mailing address in Portland, my city, possibly close enough to my office to have been incorporated with minimal effort. I hired a private investigator, a woman named Catherine, who came recommended through a contact I had made through work. I told her I was concerned about my son's estate being entangled with what appeared to be fraudulent financial structures. I paid her $15,000 to start, which was significant enough to make it real and small enough that it wouldn't trigger alarms on my financial statements if Patricia had reason to look. Catherine was good at her job. Within 3 weeks, she had provided me with documentation showing that Pinnacle Holdings was controlled by a board of 4 people. Patricia, my ex-wife, a man named Richard Foster, whom I would later discover was Patricia's current partner, a woman named Helen Carver, Patricia's sister, and a lawyer named Thomas Ashford. Thomas Ashford was the one who had sent the correspondence about the trust to Marcus. He was also, according to Catherine's research, a specialist in financial law with a reputation for operating in the murky space between what was strictly legal and what was aggressively creative. He had been investigated twice by the State Bar, twice by the IRS, and once by the FBI. None of those investigations had resulted in charges. But the pattern of investigations told its own story about the kind of work he was willing to do, the kind of advice he was willing to give. What Patricia had built with these people was a money laundering operation, and my son had been positioned at the center of it, either unknowingly at first or with increasing knowledge and distress. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became that the life I thought Marcus was living, the straightforward Silicon Valley success story, the normal 20-something navigating adulthood, was a fiction. His real role in his mother's life was as an instrument, a tool, a way to move money through the financial system while maintaining a veneer of legitimacy. And when he had started to ask questions about it, when he had started to threaten to expose it, something had happened to him. I couldn't yet prove what had happened, but I knew enough to know that his death was not a coincidence. By the beginning of autumn, 6 months after Marcus had died, I had assembled enough documentation to know the essential facts. I had statements showing the pattern of deposits and transfers. I had corporate records identifying the key players. I had Catherine's reports laying out the connections between Patricia, Richard Foster, Helen Carver, and Thomas Ashford. I had the letters my son had written, hidden in his apartment, never sent, documenting his growing distress at discovering what his mother was using him for. What I didn't have was proof of anything that would stand up in court. What I didn't have was proof that anyone had intentionally caused his death. What I didn't have was the kind of evidence that would convince a prosecutor or a judge or anyone in an official capacity that this was anything other than a tragic accident. I had suspicion. I had circumstantial evidence. I had the testimony of a dead man in letters written to no one. But I didn't have proof. Not yet. Months of patient investigation had taught me that proof didn't come from gathering more documents or connecting more dots. Proof came from having a direct conversation with someone who knew the full truth. It came from putting someone in a position where lying became more costly than honesty. It came from leverage. So I decided to do what I had always known, on some level, that I would eventually have to do. I decided to build a leverage point. I decided to force a confrontation. But unlike my initial impulse to rage and accuse and demand answers, I understood by this point that confrontation only worked if you were willing to accept the consequences of having that conversation. I wasn't raging anymore. I had moved beyond rage into something cooler, something that Patricia would have recognized from our marriage as more dangerous than any outburst could ever be. I had moved into the territory of strategic silence, of calculated patience, of a man who was willing to wait for exactly the right moment to reveal exactly the right information to exactly the right person. I started with Thomas Ashford. Catherine located him at his office in Portland, a downtown address that happened to be 3 blocks from my own office. He was a man in his late 50s, distinguished in the way that expensive haircuts and tailored suits could make almost anyone distinguished. I didn't approach him directly. Instead, I began to observe his patterns, his movements, the way he conducted his business and his personal life. I took photographs. I documented his associates. I gathered information that seemed, on its face, to have nothing to do with my son's death and everything to do with understanding exactly who this man was and what he was vulnerable to. It took me 2 weeks of careful work to understand what Thomas Ashford was most afraid of. It wasn't legal exposure. He had survived 3 separate federal investigations, which meant he was either very good at managing legal risk or very good at having connections that could manage it for him. It wasn't financial exposure. The money he was making from Pinnacle Holdings was substantial, enough that any particular transaction was replaceable. No, what Thomas Ashford was most afraid of was humiliation. He was a man with a public reputation, a man who belonged to the best clubs and was seen at the best restaurants. A man whose social standing depended entirely on the perception that he was successful and trustworthy and in control. That vulnerability, that fear of public exposure and social destruction was the leverage point I was looking for. I sent him a letter. It was simple, professional, and utterly terrifying. It said, "I have documentation of your involvement in financial structures that may be of interest to the IRS. I have documentation of the specific transactions that routed funds through my deceased son's accounts. I have documentary evidence of who authorized those transactions and who benefited from them. I am prepared to share that documentation with the appropriate federal authorities unless we have a conversation." This is not a threat. This is a notification. You have 48 hours to decide whether you want to have that conversation. I didn't sign the letter. I used no return address. I mailed it from 3 different locations in 3 different towns to confuse any potential trace. Thomas Ashford received it on a Tuesday afternoon. By Wednesday evening, his office had called my office asking if I could meet with him. What happened next was the first real confrontation. The first time I sat across from someone who knew parts of the truth and had to decide whether to protect Patricia or to protect himself. Thomas Ashford's office was on the 28th floor of a building that overlooked the city. He served me coffee in a porcelain cup. He didn't offer me a chair, which told me that he expected this meeting to be brief. "Your letter was poorly written," he said. "Threatening a lawyer about federal matters? That's not going to accomplish what you think it will." "I'm not threatening you," I replied. "I'm offering you an opportunity to tell me exactly what my ex-wife and her associates are doing with Pinnacle Holdings. I'm offering you the opportunity to explain how my son fit into that structure. I'm offering you, in short, the opportunity to choose between cooperating with me or having those documents go to the IRS." Thomas looked at me for a long moment. Then he smiled a thin, professional smile that suggested he was calculating something in his mind. "You don't have the kind of evidence that would survive legal scrutiny," he said. "You're a grieving father digging around in things you don't understand. If you were to contact the IRS with what you have, you'd be laughed at." "You're right," I said. "I'm sure the IRS would laugh at me. But you know what they wouldn't laugh at? A referral from someone inside the organization. Someone who could walk them through the structures, explain the transactions, and provide testimony about how the money was being moved. You know what the IRS takes very seriously? Cooperating witnesses from inside the scheme itself. What I was trying to do was make it clear to Thomas that his options were limited. He could deny everything and hope I didn't follow through on my threat, but why would he risk that? He could turn against Patricia and Helen and Richard and the others involved, and if he did that, His legal liability would be significantly reduced while everyone else's would increase. The math was simple. The choice was simple. The only question was whether Thomas Ashford valued his social status enough to take the fall for people he was presumably paid to help, or whether he valued his freedom more. I watched the calculation play out across his face, watched him understand that I wasn't a desperate man looking for answers. I was a focused man looking for leverage, and I had found it. "I need to think about this," he finally said. "I'll be in touch." He showed me to the door. I left his office, and I drove back to Portland, understanding that I had now set something in motion that I couldn't stop. 4 days later, my phone rang. The number was blocked, but the voice on the other end was Thomas Ashford's. "I want to meet somewhere neutral," he said. "Somewhere we won't be observed." We arranged to meet at a park in the suburb of Lake Oswego, a small community about 20 minutes south of Portland where I had sometimes taken Marcus during weekend visits. There was a trail around a man-made lake, and it was, in late autumn, quiet enough that we could talk without worrying about being overheard. Thomas arrived first. I saw him standing at the edge of the water, looking out at it with the expression of a man who had just made a decision that was going to change everything. I walked up beside him, and we stood there in silence for a moment, just two men looking at water that was beginning to freeze at the edges. "Your son," Thomas said finally, "wasn't supposed to become a problem. That's what Patricia told me. She said he asked too many questions, and she was handling it. When he died, everyone agreed that it was tragic but also convenient. No one had to decide what to do about him because the decision was made for them." I felt the world tilt. I had suspected something like this, had built my entire investigation around the belief that my son's death was not a coincidence. But hearing it stated, hearing confirmation of what I had only been able to hypothesize, hit me with a force I wasn't prepared for. "Are you saying," I asked carefully, my voice sounding strange and distant, "that my ex-wife had something to do with my son's death?" "I'm saying," Thomas replied, "that I don't know for certain whether the black ice story is accurate or whether it's a convenient fiction. I'm saying that Patricia knew about your son's intention to seek legal counsel. I'm saying that she called me and said the situation was becoming unmanageable. I'm saying that 3 days before Marcus died, Richard Foster drove up to Seattle. And I'm saying that when he came back, Patricia seemed relieved in a way that I'd never seen before. Thomas was playing a dangerous game, I understood. By telling me this, by confirming my suspicions, he was creating a witness to his testimony. He was establishing a narrative that could be used in court if this ever went public. He was also, I realized, trying to buy himself mercy from me by offering me the kind of answer I had been searching for. "I need to know if Patricia directly ordered a hit on my son," I said. "I need to know if this is something I can prove." "You can't prove that," Thomas said. "And I'm not going to testify that in open court, if that's what you're asking. What I'm telling you is the truth as I know it, which is that your son represented a liability that Patricia was determined to eliminate. How she chose to do that, who she asked to do it, what exact words were exchanged, those are things that exist between Patricia and Richard and whatever people they might have hired. I'm not party to those conversations." "Then why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because you've proven yourself resourceful enough to eventually figure it out," Thomas said. "And because I don't want to be brought down by people who don't have the same investment in covering their tracks that I do. I'm telling you because I'm choosing to survive rather than stand on principle. So it was a calculated move, a piece of self-preservation." Thomas was offering me information in hopes that I would direct my anger at Patricia and Richard and away from him. He was throwing them to the wolves in hopes that I would be satisfied with that sacrifice. It was cynical and self-serving, and it was also probably the most honest conversation he was likely to have with anyone. "What do you want?" I asked him. "I want immunity from prosecution," Thomas said. "I want whatever happens to Patricia and Richard and Helen and the others not to touch me." And I want you to understand that I'm willing to provide testimony to that effect. Sealed testimony, testimony that never makes it into open court, but exists as evidence in an investigative file, ensuring that there are official records of my cooperation. I understood what he was offering. He was offering me leverage against Patricia, but he was protecting himself from legal consequences by staying officially invisible. It was the kind of deal that would never hold up in a court of law. But it was the kind of deal that could be used as leverage in an entirely different way, personal, immediate, devastating in its own right. I had no interest in accommodating Thomas Ashford's desire to escape consequences. But I understood that what I actually needed to do was not to prosecute the people involved in my son's death. That was the work of government agencies and courts and systems that moved slowly and demanded evidence I couldn't provide. What I needed to do was to destroy them, not physically, not violently, but systematically, completely, in a way that would unravel their lives the way they had unraveled mine. I needed to make sure that every institution they cared about, every relationship they maintained, every aspect of their public and private life was exposed to the level of scrutiny that would ensure they couldn't rebuild. In short, I needed to do what the legal system couldn't or wouldn't do. I needed to burn them out from their communities and their circles and their positions of power. And I needed to do it in a way that would make sure no one could ever trace it back to me. So I made a choice in that moment, standing at the edge of that freezing lake with a man who was offering me pieces of the truth. I chose to accept exactly one piece of what Thomas was offering, the confirmation that my suspicions were correct. And then I chose to reject everything else. I turned to leave, and Thomas grabbed my arm. "You're not going to take the immunity deal?" he asked. "No," I said. "I'm not." "Then you're going to go after them," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm going to ensure that they answer for what they did," I said, "but not in the way that will help you." I pulled my arm away and walked back toward the parking lot, leaving Thomas at the edge of the lake with the understanding that his attempt at self-preservation had failed. He had given me the confirmation I needed, and now he would have to deal with the consequences of having done so. The information would travel. The truth would move through the structures that connected all of these people, and then the real reckoning would begin. If you've ever discovered that someone you trusted was willing to hurt the people you love, you understand the specific texture of that betrayal. You understand the moment when your understanding of who someone is must fundamentally shift. Have you ever had to sit with information that changed everything you thought you knew about your ex-partner or ex-spouse? The knowledge that Patricia, who had fought so hard to keep me away from my son, who had claimed she was protecting him, who had portrayed me as the threat to his well-being, had instead been using him as a tool and then eliminating him when he became inconvenient, was an understanding that rewrote every conversation we had ever had. It recontextualized every instance where she had suggested I wasn't fit to be a father. It reframed every barrier she had placed between me and my son. The whole narrative she had constructed about our relationship, about my role in Marcus's life, about who was dangerous and who was safe, it was all lies built on a foundation of using our child to move money for criminals. But I couldn't let this knowledge consume me with rage or pain, no matter how much I wanted to. The truth was becoming clear to me that the only thing that would matter from this point forward was what I did with what I knew. And what I needed to do was act with the cold precision that Thomas Ashford had recognized in my letter, the precision of a man who had moved beyond emotion into pure strategy. I went back to Catherine, my private investigator. I told her that I needed to document everything, every connection, every transaction, every piece of evidence that connected Patricia to Thomas, to Richard Foster, to Helen Carver, and to the financial scheme that had been operating for years. I needed it organized, notarized, preserved. I needed multiple copies in secure locations. I needed it prepared for release to multiple agencies simultaneously if anything ever happened to me. Catherine asked me if I was planning to go to the authorities. "Not yet," I said. First, I'm going to make sure they understand exactly what they're facing. I needed one more piece of confirmation. I needed to understand who exactly Richard Foster was and what his role had been in this operation. Catherine provided me with photographs of Richard, a man in his early 60s. Expensive car, regular routines, a mistress on the side named Alicia who worked as an art dealer in Seattle. That detail, the mistress, was important. It meant that Richard Foster, despite his involvement in what appeared to be a sophisticated criminal operation, had vulnerabilities. He had secrets that could be exposed, relationships that could be destroyed, a carefully constructed public image that could unravel with minimal pressure. I began to build a secondary file, this one focused entirely on Richard. I documented his meetings with Alicia. I documented the hotels where they spent time together. I documented the emails between them that Catherine was able to obtain through methods I didn't inquire too closely about. I was building evidence that could be used to destroy his marriage, which was also likely the thing that was most important to him in his public life. Because here was the pattern I was beginning to understand. These people weren't motivated by ideology or belief. They were motivated by the same basic human drives: power, money, status, the desire to maintain their image. And those drives could be weaponized against them. It took me 2 months to assemble everything. By the end of that period, I had documentation, photographs, recorded conversations, financial records, and the testimony of an insider who had already begun to understand that his cooperation with me had been strategic self-preservation that hadn't worked. I had evidence of a criminal enterprise. I had evidence of suspicious circumstances surrounding my son's death. I had evidence of affairs and betrayals and financial manipulations going back years. What I didn't have was the next move that didn't involve either turning everything over to the authorities or taking matters into my own hands in a way that would be obviously retaliatory and therefore traceable back to me. I stood in my apartment on a Friday evening in early winter, looking out at the city lights, understanding that I had built something and I now had to decide what to do with it. I made a phone call to Richard Foster. I had never called him before, had barely spoken to him despite the 6 years he had been involved with Patricia. He answered on the third ring, his voice cautious and uncertain. "Hello?" he said. "Mr. Foster," I said. "This is Marcus's father. I was wondering if you might have time for a conversation." I could hear the surprise and the silence that followed. Then he said, "I'm not sure what we'd have to discuss." "Oh," I said, "I think you'd find it quite relevant. It's about your relationship with my ex-wife and some of the activities that she's been involved in that you might not be fully aware of." I heard him take a breath. "Are you threatening me?" he asked. "Not threatening," I said. "Offering. I have information that might be useful to you. I have information that might help you understand the extent of Patricia's business dealings and the exact role she's been playing in financial structures that may have legal implications for you. I have information that, given your investment in certain activities, you'll probably want to be aware of." There was another long pause. Then Richard said, "I'll meet with you, but not in Portland. Somewhere neutral. Tomorrow. There's a restaurant in Eugene called Marsh," I said. "Mid-afternoon. Private table in the back." "I'll be there," Richard said, and he hung up. That night, I prepared myself for the conversation that was going to change everything. Because I understood that if Richard and I were going to have a real conversation, if I was going to show him exactly what I had uncovered, then the word would begin to spread. The secret would begin to move through the network of people involved. And once that started, there would be no putting it back in the box. The restaurant was exactly what I needed it to be: private, neutral, with enough ambient sound that our conversation couldn't be overheard by other diners. Richard arrived at exactly 3 p.m., and I saw immediately that he understood the gravity of the situation. A man doesn't show up to meet with his girlfriend's ex-husband unless he's terrified about what that meeting might contain. He was a handsome man for his age, I noticed the kind of man who had probably succeeded in life partly through his looks and partly through his ability to move through rooms with a sense of authority. Now, sitting across from me in a quiet corner of a French restaurant in Eugene, he looked like a man who had just understood that his world was collapsing. "Before you say anything," I told him, "I want to be clear about what this is. This is not a blackmail situation. This is not an extortion. This is me offering you information that you need to have in order to make choices about your future." I placed a folder on the table between us. It contained a careful selection of documents enough to show him that I knew exactly what had been happening, but not enough to put me at obvious legal risk. The bank statements showing the movement of money through Pinnacle Holdings. The corporate documents that connected him to Patricia and Thomas and Helen. The photographs of him with Alicia, taken over months, showing the pattern of his infidelity. Richard looked at the contents of the folder without touching them, his face growing paler as he registered what he was seeing. "Where did you get this?" he asked quietly. "Does it matter?" I replied. "What matters is that I have it, and what matters is what happens next." "Are you going to the police?" he asked. "No," I said. "I'm not. But I am going to determine whether you continue to have a future that looks anything like the one you currently have. I'm going to determine whether your marriage survives. I'm going to determine whether your business partners trust you. I'm going to determine whether you end up in a prison cell or end up destroying Patricia before she destroys you." I watched understanding dawn on his face. He was beginning to realize that what I was offering him was not a threat, but a choice between protecting Patricia or saving himself. "What do you want?" he asked finally. "The truth," I said. "I want to know exactly what Patricia asked you to do regarding my son. I want to know whether Marcus's death was an accident or whether it was something else. I want to know the details of how Pinnacle Holdings operates. I want to know the full scope of the money laundering operation and every institution it connects to. And if I tell you," Richard asked, "then I'm going to make sure that the blame falls in the directions where it belongs," I said. "I'm going to make sure that Patricia and Thomas and Helen understand that their partnerships are over. I'm going to make sure that the authorities have exactly the information they need to make informed decisions about who they want to prosecute. I'm going to make sure that you have the opportunity to cooperate in exchange for a lighter sentence or immunity, depending on what you did and how deeply you were involved." Richard sat back in his chair. He looked at the photographs I had left on the table, his pictures with Alicia, moments of intimacy that he had clearly believed were private, now exposed and documented. He looked like a man who was watching his life end in real time. "Your wife doesn't know about Alicia," I said quietly. "Your wife doesn't know about Pinnacle Holdings. Your wife doesn't know about any of this. And she doesn't have to find out, not if you cooperate with me." The offer was clear. Cooperate, and his wife might never know about his infidelity or his financial crimes. There was at least a chance that the legal process could be managed in a way that left some part of his personal life intact. Don't cooperate, and I would make sure that everything came out, that every detail of his affairs and his crimes would be documented and published and discussed. He didn't have to be told which option was less painful. Richard talked for 2 hours. He told me things that confirmed what Thomas had suggested, that Patricia had become concerned about Marcus threatening to expose the operation, that Richard had been asked to handle the situation, that he had driven to Seattle to meet with someone whose name he was careful not to mention, and that when he returned, the situation had been resolved. He didn't tell me that he had ordered a hit on my son. He didn't tell me that he had directly killed anyone. But he told me enough that the implications were unavoidable. He told me that Marcus had been a known liability, that Patricia had been insistent that the problem needed to be solved, that Richard had made introductions to people who handled difficult situations, and that within 48 hours of that introduction being made, Marcus had died. "Are you saying you know for certain that Marcus was murdered?" I asked him. I'm saying that the odds of the black ice killing him 48 hours after I was asked to solve the Marcus problem are low enough to be statistically improbable, Richard said. I'm saying that I've never asked for confirmation because I don't want to know for certain. I'm saying that from where I sit, Marcus was a liability who became a non-liability through means that were never directly explained to me. It was the most honest answer I was going to get. It was confirmation without confession, admission without guilt that could be prosecuted in open court. It was the kind of truth that existed in the shadows, undeniable and yet impossible to legally prove. When Richard finished talking, he asked me what I was going to do with the information. I'm going to make a decision about that, I said. You're going to go home. You're going to divorce your wife quietly and without her understanding exactly why. Or you're going to watch everything you have destroyed in the most public way possible. You're going to cooperate with law enforcement if they approach you, and you're going to tell them exactly what you've told me. Or you're going to live in the knowledge that I'm holding all of this information and that my patience is limited. Those are your choices. Richard looked like a man who had just been sentenced to a prison that didn't require bars. And Patricia? He asked. Patricia, I said, is going to have to deal with me directly. You don't need to worry about that. I left the restaurant and drove back to Portland, understanding that I had now set a series of events in motion that would eventually lead to Patricia's destruction. But before that could happen, I needed to ensure that the destruction was complete, that it was public, and that everyone she had ever betrayed understood the part they had played in her fall. The second phase of my plan required patience and precision. I couldn't simply give the evidence to the authorities and hope they would act on it. The financial crimes were complex enough that they would require months or years to prosecute, and by that time, Patricia's network would be scattered and her assets would be hidden. I needed something more immediate, more devastating. I needed to make sure that the people closest to her, the people whose opinions shaped her public image and self-perception, understood exactly who she was and what she had been doing. I began with Helen, Patricia's sister. Catherine provided me with Helen's email address, her phone number, and the information that Helen was currently very concerned about her teenage daughter's relationship with a man who worked at her daughter's high school. Helen was worried about whether the relationship was appropriate. Helen was also, according to Catherine's research, considering hiring a private investigator to look into the man's background. I sent Helen an anonymous email. The email contained only two things: a link to a website where she could access a secure folder, and the password to that folder. In that folder, I placed documentation of Patricia's activities with Pinnacle Holdings, along with a note: your sister has been using money derived from financial crimes to build her life. The money she gave to your daughter for college came from illegal sources. The money she donated to your church came from illegal sources. The money she invested in your business came from illegal sources. What you do with this information is your choice, but I thought you deserved to know who your sister actually is. Within 36 hours, Helen had called Patricia and confronted her about the information. I know this because I had hired someone to monitor calls between them, something illegal and therefore something I knew I could never use in a court of law, but something I could certainly use to understand the fallout from my revelations. Patricia's response to Helen was to claim the information was fabricated, a lie created by a vindictive ex-husband trying to destroy her. She didn't know where the evidence had come from. She didn't know who had put together the documentation. And she was terrified. That terror, I understood, was the beginning of what I was looking for. I watched Patricia's behavior change over the following weeks. She became paranoid, suspicious, careful about every message she sent and every conversation she had. She contacted Thomas and told him to stop all communication with her immediately, which Thomas did, understanding that the walls were beginning to collapse. She distanced herself from Helen, recognizing that her sister was now a liability to her rather than an asset. She tried to contact Richard, but Richard didn't answer her calls. By the time Patricia realized that her entire network was fragmenting, she had become isolated in a way that I had spent months carefully engineering. And then came the second devastating blow, the one that would ensure that no one believed her anymore, that no one would defend her, that she would become radioactive to everyone she had ever known. I provided all of my documentation to a journalist named Daniel. Daniel worked for a Seattle-based independent news outlet that specialized in investigating financial corruption and white-collar crime. I didn't give him everything. I was careful to hold back information that could be used to identify me as the source. But I gave him enough. I gave him the bank statements. I gave him the corporate documents. I gave him the pattern of money movement that suggested an organized financial crime. I gave him Richard's cooperation and his willingness to provide testimony. Most crucially, I gave him the timeline and the proximity between Patricia's conversations about eliminating Marcus as a problem and Marcus's sudden death on a highway. Daniel spent 3 weeks verifying the information. He contacted the authorities. He contacted the FBI. He built a case that was airtight enough that within a month, federal agents were executing search warrants on Patricia's home and office. The story broke on a Monday morning. Federal investigation into Seattle area money laundering ring points to tragic connections. The article was devastating. It laid out the entire scheme, the money movement, the dates and times. It didn't accuse Patricia directly of anything that would constitute libel, but it provided enough context that every person who read it would understand exactly what had happened. And it mentioned, very carefully, that the investigation had been opened after concerns were raised about the death of a young man who had been at the center of the financial structures being investigated. The story didn't prove that Patricia had ordered Marcus's death, but it strongly implied that there were questions about the circumstances of his death that warranted additional investigation, and that those questions arose specifically from the timing of his death relative to the financial concerns he had raised. By the time the article was published, I was in San Francisco, checking into a hotel under an assumed name, ensuring that I was out of the immediate Portland area when everything began to come apart. I watched the story spread through social media and news outlets. I watched as Patricia's friends and colleagues began to distance themselves from her, understanding that association with her was now association with a financial crime and potentially something far worse. I watched as her professional reputation, carefully built over 2 decades in her field, evaporated in 48 hours. I watched as the people she had trusted began to testify against her, each one understanding that cooperation with the federal investigation was their only path to reducing their own criminal exposure. What Patricia had not understood was that the people involved in her operation had no loyalty to her. They had been willing participants in a criminal scheme, but they were not willing to sacrifice themselves to protect her. And when the first person broke, which was Thomas, understanding that his strategic offering of limited information to me had been a failure and that he needed to provide much more substantial cooperation to save himself, the entire structure collapsed like a building whose foundational walls had been removed. Within 6 months, federal charges had been filed against Patricia, Thomas, Richard, and Helen. Patricia was charged with money laundering, conspiracy, and financial fraud. The charges related to her son's death could not be filed because there was no proof in the legal sense that she had ordered that death. But in the court of public opinion, she had already been convicted. She was the mother who had used her son as a tool. She was the woman whose ambition and greed had resulted in the death of a young man who had simply wanted to do the right thing. She was radioactive in a way that no legal conviction could have accomplished. But the victory, I was beginning to understand, came with costs. The evidence I had used to destroy her was evidence that had been gathered illegally in several cases. The information that Daniel had published was information that could potentially be traced back to me if, Someone looked carefully enough at the chain of custody. The fact that I was the obvious suspect for orchestrating the destruction of Patricia's life meant that I was also potentially at risk if someone decided to prosecute the crimes I had committed to gather the evidence. I had destroyed my ex-wife and her associates, but I had done so by becoming, in several important ways, a criminal myself. And that knowledge was beginning to weigh on me in a way that I hadn't anticipated. It was the price of the justice I had achieved, and it was the price I would have to live with. Have you ever had to make a choice between letting injustice stand or committing crimes yourself to expose that injustice? Have you ever wondered whether justice obtained through illegal means was still actually justice, or whether it had transformed into something else entirely, something potentially more corrupt than the original crimes it was meant to expose? I was living in an apartment in San Francisco when the first knock came on the door. It was federal agents, and they had questions about my investigation into Pinnacle Holdings and about how a journalist had come into possession of evidence that would support federal criminal charges against Patricia and her associates. I had expected this. I had prepared for it. When they asked me how Daniel had obtained the information, I told them honestly that I didn't know, that I had shared some information with Daniel but not the bulk of what he had published. I did not tell them about Catherine or about the illegal methods she had used to obtain some of the evidence. I did not tell them about the anonymous email I had sent to Helen or about the way I had monitored Patricia's phone calls. I told them a partial truth that was legally defensible and that would not result in my own prosecution. The agents seemed satisfied with this. They thanked me for my cooperation and for bringing information to the attention of law enforcement. They told me that the investigation was proceeding well and that Patricia and her associates would likely face significant prison time, and then they left. I sat in my apartment afterward and understood that I had successfully navigated the immediate legal danger. But the broader question remained: had I done the right thing? I had avenged my son's death, or at least I had ensured that the people responsible for his death faced consequences. But at what cost? And at what point did the cost of seeking justice become higher than the cost of the injustice itself? These were the questions that began to consume me in the months following the federal investigation. These were the questions that would define the next phase of my life. But then something unexpected happened. Something that changed the nature of my victory and forced me to reconsider everything I thought I had accomplished. Richard Foster, facing several years in prison for his role in the Pinnacle Holdings scheme and for his part in facilitating whatever had happened to Marcus, decided that he was willing to provide more substantial cooperation with federal authorities. And in the course of that cooperation, he revealed something that I had not anticipated. He provided testimony that Marcus's death had not been an accident. He provided testimony that he had been asked to arrange the death. He provided testimony that he had made introductions to someone he described as a facilitator of difficult situations, which was legal language for someone who performed crimes for money. And he provided enough information that the FBI was able to identify and charge that person, a man named Gregory Thorne, who had a decades-long history of violent crimes and who appeared to have been responsible for numerous deaths that had been labeled as accidents or suicides or crimes of opportunity. When Gregory Thorne was arrested and charged with Marcus's death, when the evidence was presented showing that he had received payment from Richard Foster to travel to Seattle and to cause an accident that would result in my son's death, the nature of my victory changed. I was no longer a man who had exposed a financial crime and brought criminals to justice. I was the son of a murdered boy, the person whose grief had set in motion a chain of events that had resulted in the identification of a serial killer and the closing of cold cases stretching back decades. The publicity that followed Gregory Thorne's arrest and the revelation of his crimes was enormous. The media narrative shifted from financial crime ring exposed to serial killer arrested after decades of murders. Marcus became one of dozens of victims whose deaths were suddenly recontextualized. The memorial services and the news coverage brought a level of attention to my son's death that I had not expected, and that I found in many ways to be deeply uncomfortable. But it also meant something else. It meant that Patricia could be charged with conspiracy to commit murder. It meant that she could face significantly more serious prison time. It meant that the justice system, working through legitimate legal channels with evidence that could now be openly prosecuted, would result in consequences for my ex-wife that went far beyond financial fraud. The trial took 14 months. I testified. The prosecutors presented evidence. Patricia's defense was that she had been unaware of the exact nature of Richard's solution to the Marcus problem, that she had never explicitly asked him to arrange a death, that whatever had happened was beyond the scope of her knowledge or responsibility. The jury didn't believe her. By the time the trial concluded, Patricia had been convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and sentenced to 30 years in prison. She was 63 years old. She would likely die in prison. The victory was complete, or as complete as such a victory could be. And yet, standing outside the courthouse after the sentencing, I felt something very different from what I had expected to feel. I didn't feel satisfaction. I didn't feel triumph. I felt hollowed out, emptied, as if the process of destroying Patricia had required me to destroy something essential in myself as well. I had become someone willing to commit crimes, to manipulate people, to orchestrate the destruction of lives. I had become someone capable of doing what Patricia had been willing to do, putting aside conventional morality in service of a larger goal. The only difference was that my larger goal was justice for my murdered son, which seemed noble until I examined it closely and realized that nobility was subjective and that from Patricia's perspective, she had been protecting her financial interests, which seemed just as important to her as my son's life seemed to me. I was not different from Patricia. I was simply on a different side of the same equation. That realization was the hardest part of the entire process. That recognition that I had become the kind of person I despised. That understanding that justice, pursued with sufficient ruthlessness and without sufficient oversight, becomes indistinguishable from cruelty. If you had been in my position, would you have made the same choices? Would you have been willing to compromise your own moral standing to ensure that the people who had hurt you faced consequences? Would you have understood the distinction between justice and revenge, or would you have, like me, eventually recognized that there was no meaningful distinction between the two? The final phase of this story is not about triumph. It's about the aftermath, about the slow recognition that destroying your enemies doesn't repair what they destroyed. It's about the understanding that comes when the rage has finally burned itself out and you're left with silence and the complicated landscape of a life that has been fundamentally altered. After Patricia's sentencing, I returned to Portland. I went back to my job. I went back to my apartment and my daily routines and the surface-level normalcy of a man who had managed to navigate a profound trauma and come out the other side. But I was different. Everyone could see it, even if they couldn't quite articulate what the difference was. My colleagues at work gave me space that hadn't been required before. My acquaintances treated me with a carefulness that suggested they understood something fundamental had shifted in me. I had gone into this process as a grieving father. I had emerged as someone who had orchestrated the destruction of multiple lives, who had committed crimes in service of seeking justice, who had fundamentally altered the lives of everyone involved, including my own. I had won. But what had I won, exactly? My son was still dead. Patricia was in prison, but my son was still dead. Richard Foster was in prison, and Thomas Ashford was in prison, and Helen was serving her sentence, and Gregory Thorne was serving a life sentence, and my son was still dead. None of what I had accomplished had changed that fundamental reality. What I had accomplished was to ensure that everyone responsible for his death faced consequences, and perhaps that mattered. Perhaps that was enough. But the recognition that came later, the recognition that took months to develop and that I still struggle with, is that my victory over Patricia came with a specific cost to my own sense of self. I had become someone willing to commit crimes. I had become someone willing to manipulate other people. I had become someone willing to orchestrate outcomes based on incomplete information and strategic advantage rather than complete truth. In other words, I had become someone willing to do exactly what Patricia had been willing to do. The only difference was that my crimes had served a different master, not greed or ambition, but grief and the desire for justice. But from the inside, the subjective experience of committing crimes in service of justice is not significantly different from committing crimes in service of greed. You still lie. You still manipulate. You still violate other people's rights in service of your goals. You simply have better reasons for doing so. I was sitting in a therapy office about 6 months after Patricia's sentencing when I first articulated this recognition to someone else. The therapist, a woman named Dr. Sarah Chun, listened quietly as I explained the choices I had made, the crimes I had committed, the people I had manipulated, all in service of achieving justice for my murdered son. When I finished, she asked me a single question. Do you think your son would be proud of the choices you made? I didn't have an answer for her. I knew, from the letters he had left for me, that Marcus had valued integrity. He had valued honesty. He had valued doing the right thing even when it was difficult. And I had learned, through the process of investigating his death, that he had been willing to sacrifice his own safety to expose the truth about what his mother was doing. I had become someone willing to destroy other people to expose that same truth. I had become someone willing to commit crimes in service of justice. And I wasn't certain that Marcus would have wanted that. I wasn't certain that he would have wanted me to transform myself into the kind of person who could orchestrate what I had orchestrated. The months following this realization were hard in ways that were different from the months immediately following his death. In those early months, my grief had been raw and immediate and all-consuming. But as time passed and as the legal consequences for Patricia and her associates began to settle into permanence, a different kind of pain emerged. It was the pain of recognizing that my attempt to repair the damage that had been done had itself caused damage. It was the pain of understanding that my son, who had been killed by people who believed that the ends justified the means, had been avenged by me, someone else willing to believe that the ends justified the means. The cycle hadn't broken. It had simply rotated to include me. I started attending a support group for people who had lost family members to violent crimes. It was in these meetings, surrounded by other people processing their own grief and their own moral compromises, that I began to understand that what I had done was not unique. I was not the only person who had decided that justice served through proper legal channels was insufficient, that personal vengeance was necessary, that the ends justified the means. And I was not the only person who had then had to grapple with the moral implications of that decision. One woman in the group, named Rita, had poisoned her son's murderer after he was released from prison on a technicality. Another man, named James, had hired people to assault his daughter's rapist in an alley. And a third woman, named Patricia, a different Patricia from my ex-wife, but with the same name nonetheless, had systematically destroyed the career and reputation of a teacher who had abused her son and who had successfully evaded prosecution through legal technicalities. We were all people who had suffered injustice. We were all people who had decided that the injustice was unacceptable and who had taken matters into our own hands. And we were all living with the consequences of those decisions. Rita told me that the poisoning had worked. The man died, suffering greatly, but that the knowledge that she had intentionally caused his death had never left her. She had won her revenge. But the cost had been the fundamental alteration of her self-image. She was no longer a grieving mother. She was a woman who had killed another human being, justified or not. James said that the assault had changed him in ways he still didn't fully understand. He had destroyed his daughter's rapist's ability to assault anyone else. But he had also transformed himself into a man capable of orchestrating violence, and that transformation had never fully reversed itself. Patricia said that ruining the teacher's reputation and career had felt like justice at the time, but years later, she had discovered that he had committed suicide after his arrest, and the knowledge that her actions had contributed to someone's death, even someone guilty of terrible crimes, had never stopped haunting her. We were all survivors of a specific kind of injustice, the injustice of losing someone we loved to violence or abuse. And we were all people who had decided that formal justice was insufficient and that we needed to take action ourselves. And we were all people who were now living with the consequences of that action. That's when I began to understand something crucial about my own situation. The victory I had achieved, Patricia's conviction, her 30-year sentence, the exposure of the financial crime ring, the identification of a serial killer was real, but it was also incomplete. It was incomplete because my achievement of that victory had required me to become someone capable of committing crimes, and that capability had not disappeared after achieving the victory. I was still that person. I was a man who knew how to manipulate people and corrupt systems and orchestrate outcomes. I was a man who had proven to myself that I was capable of doing whatever was necessary to achieve my goals. That knowledge didn't disappear when Patricia went to prison. That knowledge became a part of who I was. And the crucial question that emerged from this recognition was, what was I going to do with that knowledge? Was I going to become someone who continued to use the capabilities I had developed to manipulate and corrupt and orchestrate? Or was I going to somehow find a way to put those capabilities aside and return to a more conventional life? This was the second great reckoning of my journey, and it was in many ways more difficult than the first one because it didn't have a clear external solution. Patricia's conviction had been external. Justice had been served through legitimate legal channels, even if I had had to commit crimes to make that justice possible. But this new reckoning, the reckoning with myself, with who I had become, that was something that couldn't be solved through external action. That was something that could only be solved through internal change, through a genuine transformation of character. I made a decision then that surprised me in its simplicity. I decided to confess. Not to confess to the crimes I had committed, Catherine's surveillance methods, and the illegal monitoring of phone calls and the anonymous emails that I had sent, but to confess to my role in the investigation that had led to Patricia's conviction. I went to the FBI office in Portland and I told them exactly what I had done and how I had done it. I told them about the private investigator and the extent of her methods. I told them about the information I had gathered and the decisions I had made about what to do with that information. I told them about Daniel the journalist and about how I had chosen to shape his investigation through strategic revelation of information. I told them everything. The FBI agent who interviewed me was a woman named Sarah Morrison, and she listened to my confession with an expression that I couldn't quite read. When I finished, she asked me if I understood that what I was admitting to constituted multiple federal crimes. I said that I did understand that. She asked me if I was willing to testify to these facts in open court if necessary. I said that I was. And then she asked me the same question that Dr. Chun had asked me months earlier. Why are you telling me this? I had to think about that for a long time before I could answer. The honest answer was that I was trying to break the cycle. I had committed crimes in service of justice. I had destroyed people to achieve that justice. And now I needed to subject myself to consequences as well. I needed to ensure that I wasn't somehow exempt from the moral and legal frameworks that I believed should apply to everyone else. I needed to demonstrate that I took moral responsibility for my actions, even when those actions had served what I believed to be a just cause. What I didn't expect was what would happen next. Sarah Morrison told me that she would need to report my confession to her supervisors. but that she would also be recommending that any charges against me be considered in the context of the investigation into Patricia and the larger financial crime that my investigation had exposed. She told me that my cooperation and my honesty would likely result in leniency if charges were to be filed. She also told me something else, that Richard Foster, while providing testimony against Patricia, had already disclosed the role that an investigator had played in exposing the financial crime. He had told the FBI that he believed a professional had been hired to investigate Patricia and the operation. The fact that I was now confessing to being involved in that investigation, even though I was not a professional investigator, actually served to corroborate Richard's testimony and to make the case stronger, because it showed that multiple independent sources had arrived at similar conclusions about Patricia's activities. In other words, my confession was not going to result in my prosecution. It was going to be useful to the federal authorities because it provided additional evidence and corroboration for the crimes that Patricia and her associates had committed. The irony was almost overwhelming. I had confessed to crimes in order to subject myself to consequences and to break the cycle of moral compromise that I had fallen into. And that confession had instead become a piece of evidence that would serve to strengthen the case against the people I had been investigating. I was still not being held accountable. I was still being protected by the same system of justice that I had been trying to expose. The moral balance had not shifted. I had still committed crimes, and I was still escaping consequences for those crimes. I had simply been absorbed into the system rather than held accountable by the system. This recognition led me to a different conclusion about what I needed to do. If the formal system of justice was not going to hold me accountable, if my crimes in service of justice were going to be forgiven or incorporated into the larger investigation, then I needed to hold myself accountable. I needed to find a way to ensure that my actions had a price, that my moral compromise resulted in genuine sacrifice rather than victory. I made a decision that surprised everyone who knew me. I left my job. I left Portland. I left the life that I had carefully built over decades of work and effort. I donated the majority of my financial resources not to anyone specific, but to organizations that work to prevent violent crime and to support families of murder victims. I gave away the apartment. I gave away the furniture and the expensive things that had accumulated around me. And I moved to a small community in rural Oregon where nobody knew who I was or what I had done. I became someone different. I worked as a counselor for people dealing with grief and loss. I volunteered with organizations that investigated cold cases and helped families who believed that justice had been denied. I became someone whose purpose was not to seek revenge against injustice, but to help others navigate the aftermath of injustice. This transformation was not redemption, exactly. I don't believe in redemption in the traditional sense. I don't believe that I somehow cleansed my moral standing by becoming a counselor, or by giving away my money, or by removing myself from a life of material success. But I do believe that there is value in recognizing the cost of what you have done and in working, for the remainder of your life, to at least attempt to balance that cost against genuine good. Have you ever had to fundamentally change your life because of who you had become? Have you ever made choices that you regretted so profoundly that the only way to live with them was to become someone different? The years that followed were characterized by a kind of peace that I had not experienced before my investigation into Patricia's crimes. But it was a peace built on a foundation of loss and sacrifice rather than on a foundation of triumph. I had achieved justice for my murdered son, but I had done so by becoming someone willing to commit crimes, and I had spent the years afterward trying to become someone different, someone who could live with what I had done while also working to ensure that such actions were not necessary. Marcus's death was never going to be repaired. The time I had missed with him, the relationship we never had the opportunity to fully develop, the future that was stolen from him, none of that could be fixed. But I had made sure that the people responsible for his death paid a price for it. And I had made sure, over time, that the capabilities I had developed in service of that justice were redirected toward helping other people in similar situations navigate their own grief and loss. It wasn't redemption, but it was something. It was a life built on the recognition that justice is necessary, but that it also has a cost, and that cost should never be ignored or minimized. The final thing I want to say is something about silence. The work that I did to expose Patricia's crimes was characterized by silence, the silence of watching and waiting, the silence of gathering evidence without confronting, the silence of holding terrible knowledge while appearing to live a normal life. There is a power in silence that I didn't fully understand until I was deep in the process of investigating my ex-wife. Silence is not weakness. Silence is not absence. Silence is sometimes the most eloquent form of presence. And it was my willingness to maintain silence, to resist the urge to confront and accuse before I had evidence, to wait for the right moment to reveal what I knew. It was that silence that ultimately gave me the leverage to ensure that justice was served. I learned through my investigation that the visible expression of anger and grief and loss is often less effective than the hidden accumulation of evidence and knowledge. I learned that people who operate outside the law are most vulnerable to exposure when they don't realize they're being observed. I learned that justice served coldly and strategically is often more effective than justice pursued with visible rage and accusation. These are hard lessons. They are lessons that I carry with me as I move forward in my life, working with people who have lost loved ones to violence and who are struggling with the question of how to seek justice when the formal system has failed them. And I tell them that justice is necessary, that the desire to make the people who hurt you face consequences is legitimate and should never be made to feel shameful. But I also tell them that the means by which you pursue justice matter profoundly, because every compromise you make in service of seeking justice changes you in ways that cannot be undone. I tell them that they should seek justice through legitimate channels first, that they should exhaust every official and legal avenue before considering taking matters into their own hands. And I tell them that if they do decide to take matters into their own hands, they need to understand that they are committing themselves to a transformation of self that they may never fully recover from. This is the truth that I have learned through my experience. And this is what I wish I had known when I first received that phone call telling me that my son had died. If you are someone facing injustice that the formal system has failed to address, I want you to know that your desire for justice is legitimate. But I also want you to know that achieving that justice through your own efforts will change you in ways that you cannot anticipate. And the question you need to ask yourself is not whether you are willing to do whatever is necessary to expose the truth, but whether you are willing to live forever with the knowledge that you have done so. Because that knowledge never leaves you. That knowledge becomes part of who you are. And you spend the rest of your life trying to integrate it into a self that you can live with, trying to ensure that the capabilities you developed in service of justice don't become the permanent foundation of who you are as a person. This is the journey that my son's death sent me on. This is the understanding that I have gained through the process of exposing and destroying the people responsible for his murder. And this is the legacy that I carry forward into the work that I do now, in service of helping other people navigate the profound injustice of losing loved ones to violence, and in service of helping them understand that while justice is necessary, it also has a price that should never be ignored. The work continues. The pain doesn't go away. But somewhere in the space between justice and revenge, between exposure and silence, between revenge and transformation, there is a kind of peace available to us. It's not the peace of having won. It's the peace of having survived, of having faced the worst in yourself and having chosen, at least for now, to become something better. And for me, that peace has had to be enough.